Before the water came, the world may have felt older than fear. Not safe, exactly. No ancient world was ever truly safe. There were storms, illnesses, hunger, wandering animals in the dark, and nights when the wind moved through the reeds with a voice that sounded almost human. But still, to the people who lived beside rivers and shorelines, the earth may have seemed familiar. The river returned to its banks. The moon returned to the water. The seasons moved in their slow circle. The same paths led from house to field, from field to shrine, from shrine to the place where boats were tied in the quiet evening. And because everything returned, people may have believed that the world itself would always return. Imagine an ancient valley before sunrise. Mist rests low over the river, pale and silver, drifting between stands of reeds. The mud is cool beneath bare feet. A few small boats wait at the bank, their ropes damp from the night air. Smoke rises from cooking fires, thin and blue, curling above houses made from reed, clay, wood, or sun-dried brick. Inside one house, a child sleeps beside a woven mat. Outside, someone stirs the ashes of last night's fire. Far away, a dog barks once, then falls silent. And above everything, the stars begin to fade. This is not one exact place. It is not one proven city before one proven flood. It is more like a memory scattered across many ancient landscapes. A river valley in Mesopotamia. A village near the edge of a marsh. A coast where the sea once stood farther away than it does now. A low plain where people planted grain in dark soil and listened for the first birds before dawn. In such places, life followed water. Water fed the fields. Water carried boats. Water gave fish, clay, reeds, and paths through the land. Water made settlements possible. And because water gave life, people watched it closely. They knew the color of a river before rain. They knew how the banks smelled when the level rose. They knew where to place a wall of mud brick, where to store grain, where to pull boats high onto the shore. The river was not only a river. It was a calendar. A road. A boundary. A gift. And sometimes, a warning. Long before written history became clear to us, human beings were already living with memory. They told stories beside firelight. They remembered where ancestors were buried. They knew which bend in the river was good for fishing, which hill stayed dry in winter, which spring tasted of stone, which grove belonged to a god or a spirit or a name too old to translate. At night, when the day's work had ended, the world softened. The fields turned dark. The river held the stars. People sat in the glow of small fires and spoke of things older than themselves. They may have told children how the first village began, how the gods shaped clay, how the first seeds were found, how a strange bird once led a family to water, how the sea had once been farther away, or closer, or not there at all. A story, in such a world, was not only entertainment. It was a shelter for memory. It kept the past alive when the people who had seen it were gone. And perhaps this is where the oldest flood stories begin. Not with one moment. Not with one storm. But with the quiet human need to remember that water had once changed everything. In Mesopotamian tradition, some of the most famous ancient flood stories were written down in texts that still feel strangely alive after thousands of years. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero hears of a great flood from Utnapishtim, a survivor chosen to preserve life when the gods decide that a deluge will cover the world. In the story of Atrahasis, humanity's noise troubles the gods, and a flood becomes part of a larger myth about creation, divine frustration, and survival. These are myths. They are not modern historical reports. They do not give us a simple window into one exact event. But they do preserve something powerful. They preserve the image of a world overwhelmed by water, and of a small remnant carrying life forward. Other ancient traditions remember great waters too. Greek stories tell of Deucalion and Pyrrha, survivors of a flood who begin the human world again. Far from Greece and Mesopotamia, many cultures have told their own stories of waters rising, lands lost, ancestors surviving, and a new beginning after devastation. The details differ. The gods differ. The reasons differ. Sometimes the flood is punishment. Sometimes cleansing. Sometimes a mystery. Sometimes the story is about one family. Sometimes it is about a whole world. But again and again, the same image returns. Water comes. The old world disappears. A few survive. And after the water, life begins again. For sleep, we do not need to force these stories into one explanation. We can let them rest beside one another, like lamps along a long riverbank. Each one glows in its own place. Each one tells us that ancient people, separated by language, land, and time, found meaning in the thought of a great flood. And perhaps, beneath the myth, beneath the sacred poetry, there was an older human feeling. The feeling that the earth itself could change. That familiar places could vanish. That the land beneath a family's feet might not always remain. Before such a realization, the world may have seemed fixed. A child growing up beside a river might believe the reed beds would always be there. The old road to the next village would always run through the same grove of trees. The shore would always lie at the same distance. The ancestors' graves would always remain on the same hill. The temple, whether made of mud brick, wood, stone, or clay, would always face the same sunrise. People knew that lives changed. They knew that children grew old, elders died, animals wandered, houses cracked, and fields failed. But the earth itself may have felt like the one thing beneath all change. Slow. Patient. Reliable. A person could step outside at night and see the same stars reflected in the same water. They could follow the same path their mother had followed. They could hear the same river their grandfather had heard as a child. The world held memory for them. The land remembered. And because the land remembered, people could believe that they belonged. Picture a small settlement near a wide river in the warm dark. The houses are low and close together. Their walls are made from mud brick, packed by hand and dried beneath the sun. Clay jars stand near doorways. A wooden plow rests beside a wall. Nets hang from poles. Reeds whisper at the river's edge. Somewhere nearby, a small shrine holds offerings, a bowl of grain, a cup of water, a carved figure, a stone smoothed by many hands. No one thinks of this place as ancient. To the people living there, it is simply home. The road beyond the village leads to other homes. The river bends toward other fields. The world is wide, but not endless. Known places are tied together by walking, by boats, by marriages, by stories, by trade, by the movement of animals and the slow repetition of seasons. At dusk, boats return. A merchant lowers a bundle onto the bank. A fisherman washes mud from his hands. A mother calls softly to a child near the reeds. An old man watches the river and says that the water is higher than it was last year, or lower, or strange in some small way. The others listen. Then the evening continues. Because ancient life, like modern life, was full of signs that did not yet look like endings. A river rises. A storm lasts longer than expected. A shoreline erodes. A marsh spreads. A path becomes muddy for one season, then another. People notice. People adapt. They move a storehouse. They build a bank higher. They tell children not to play too close to the water. They remember older floods, smaller floods, floods that ruined fields but passed away. And because those floods passed away, they assume the next one will pass away too. This is the gentleness and danger of familiarity. The world teaches people its rhythms, and people learn them so well that they begin to trust them. The river rises, then falls. The rains come, then end. The sea storms, then quiets. The ground softens, then dries. Again and again, the world returns to itself. Until one day, perhaps, it does not. In some places, real ancient landscapes did change dramatically over long periods. Ice melted after the last ice age. Seas rose. Coastlines shifted. Lowlands disappeared beneath water. Rivers changed their courses. Marshes expanded and retreated. Settlements that once stood near dry land may have found themselves closer to water, then surrounded by it, then gone. Archaeologists and climate researchers study such changes carefully, through sediments, shorelines, submerged sites, pollen, shells, tools, and traces left in mud and stone. But this story is not trying to prove that every flood myth comes from one event. It is quieter than that. It asks what such changes may have felt like to the people who remembered them. What happens inside human memory when the world does not stay where it was? What happens when the sea moves over old paths? What happens when grandparents point toward the water and say, "Our fields were there"? The answer may be part history, part myth, part dream. Because ancient memory does not always preserve the past the way a map does. Sometimes it preserves the feeling of the past. The fear. The loss. The awe. The lesson. A people who remembered rising water might not say, "The shoreline advanced slowly across generations." They might say, "The gods opened the deep." They might not say, "The river system failed after unusual rains and changing land conditions." They might say, "The heavens poured down and the old world drowned." They might not say, "Our settlement was abandoned when the marsh expanded." They might say, "Our ancestors escaped in a boat while the waters covered the earth." Myth speaks in images large enough to hold grief. And water, in myth, can hold almost everything. It can be birth. It can be death. It can be cleansing. It can be punishment. It can be the deep before creation. It can be the sea that takes a home and the river that gives one back. Before the great water, if we imagine such a world, people may have lived with a softer confidence. They may have feared hunger, illness, strangers, drought, and storm. But perhaps they did not yet fear the disappearance of the world itself. The river valley was there. The coast was there. The old burial mound was there. The shrine was there. The road was there. The earth had shape. And shape gives comfort. Even a poor house feels safer when the hill behind it remains, when the path home is visible, when the stars appear where they appeared before. A person can endure uncertainty if the world around that uncertainty feels steady. So in the world before the water, the deepest trust may not have been in kings or walls or tools. It may have been in return. The return of morning. The return of birds. The return of planting. The return of the river to its banks. The return of the sea to its edge. The return of stories told again in the same place where they had always been told. And in that repetition, meaning grew. Temples rose slowly from clay and stone. Not always grand. Not always built to impress from far away. Some sacred places may have been small, no more than a raised platform, a room of packed earth, a post, a stone, a hearth, a painted wall, a place where offerings gathered over time. People brought grain, milk, oil, small figures, shells, flowers. Words spoken too softly to travel beyond the doorway. A temple was not only a house for a god. It was a way of placing order in the world. Here is the sacred place. Here is the river. Here is the field. Here is the path. Here is where the living come to remember the dead. Here is where the people ask the unseen world to keep its pattern. And perhaps, before the water, the gods themselves were imagined as part of that pattern. A god of storm who came in season. A river spirit who rose and withdrew. A mother goddess who watched grain grow. A sky god whose stars wheeled slowly overhead. The divine did not always mean peace. Gods could be fierce, demanding, distant, unpredictable. But they still belonged to a world that had rhythms. Offerings were made. Festivals returned. The moon became full and thin again. Smoke rose. Names were spoken. The year turned. Then, somewhere in the long human story, the balance began to change. Perhaps not everywhere. Perhaps not all at once. Perhaps only in one valley, then another. A rain that lingered beyond its season. A river that climbed too high. A shoreline that moved farther inland each year. A low path that stayed wet. A village that rebuilt closer to the hill. A fishing place that vanished. A spring that turned brackish. A grave mound surrounded by reeds. A field remembered beneath shallow water. At first, such changes would have been folded into ordinary life. People are patient when they must be. They repair. They lift. They move. They remember. They say, the water was high when my father was young. They say, the sea has eaten the old trees. They say, do not build there now. And still the fires are lit at night. Still the children sleep. Still boats are tied to the banks. Still stars shine over the roofs. But memory begins to gather. Each season adds a little more. Each story shifts the shape of the past. The old people speak more often of how things were. The young people hear of a world they cannot see. There was a road there once. There were houses beyond that marsh. There was a shrine where the waves now break. Our people lived closer to the sea, or farther from it. The river had another path. The world was different. This may be how a flood begins in memory. Not only as water, but as comparison. Before and after. What was here? What is here now? What vanished? What remained? And as the old balance grew fragile, the night may have felt different. The same moon rose, but it shone on higher water. The same stars appeared, but their reflections trembled over places where people had once walked. The same river moved through the dark, but now its sound carried a question. A question no one could yet answer. Was the world changing for a season? Or had the world begun to become something else? At first, the water may not have seemed like an ending. It may have seemed like weather. A long rain. A river running higher than usual. A marsh spreading a little farther into the grass. A shoreline that looked different when the morning mist lifted. The world rarely announces that it is changing forever. More often, it changes slowly, almost politely, asking people to move one step, then another, until one day they look back and see that the place they began from has disappeared. Imagine a village near rising water. The houses stand low beside the river, their walls made from clay and reeds, their roofs darkened by years of smoke. Boats are pulled close to the bank. Clay jars sit near doorways. Bundles of grain rest inside woven baskets. The old path to the fields runs beyond the last house, past a line of trees, then down toward land that has fed the village for generations. But this year, the path is wet. Not washed away. Not broken. Only wet. At dawn, a child steps onto it and feels mud close around the feet. A woman carrying water pauses and looks down. An old man says the river has been high before. And everyone continues with the day, because life has always required people to continue. The fires are lit. The grain is sorted. The nets are mended. The river moves beside them, brown and patient. Then the rain returns. Soft at first. A whisper on the roofs. A silver trembling across the river's skin. It falls through the night, and in the morning the banks look smaller. Reeds bend under the weight of water. The place where children used to sit with their feet in the mud is gone beneath a shallow current. The boats rise higher on their ropes. No one calls it a flood yet. They call it a hard season. They call it a strange year. They call it something that will pass. And perhaps, in many places, it did pass. Most ancient floods came and went. Rivers rose and withdrew. Fields were damaged and planted again. Houses cracked and were repaired. People grieved what was lost, then returned to the same ground because the same ground still held them. But in some memories, the water did not simply pass. It stayed. Or returned. Or rose in stages, each time leaving the world slightly less familiar. The old road to the fields became a ribbon of mud. Then a channel. Then a shallow stream. Then, one morning, a line of water stretching quietly under the pale sky, with only the tops of stones showing where feet had once passed. Picture that old path going underwater. It does not vanish all at once. The first stones disappear in autumn. The low place near the reeds disappears in winter. By spring, the bend near the fig tree can only be crossed by boat. And by the next season, the path is no longer a path. It is a memory beneath water. People still know where it is. They can point to it. They can say, there, under that shining surface, the road turned toward the fields. But knowing is not the same as walking. And this is one of the quietest forms of loss. When a place remains visible, but unreachable. A village can survive such changes for a while. People move storage jars to higher shelves. They lift sleeping mats onto platforms. They build small banks of packed earth around doorways. They tie boats closer. They drive animals toward firmer ground. They learn new routes. They speak of temporary things. Only for this season. Only until the water falls. Only until the fields dry. But water has its own patience. Rivers swell. Rain gathers in lowlands. Marsh grasses spread where grain once grew. The shore moves inland grain by grain, wave by wave, year by year. And slowly, the world people trusted begins to loosen. The boundary between land and water becomes uncertain. A field becomes a wet field. A wet field becomes reeds. Reeds become marsh. Marsh becomes open water. The names remain longer than the places. People still speak of the barley field long after barley no longer grows there. They still mention the southern road after no one can take it. They still call a drowned grove by the name of its trees, though only the upper branches appear when the water is low. This is how the flood becomes memory before it becomes myth. Not because everything ends in a single moment. But because the world begins to refuse its old names. In the ancient stories, the water is often described as enormous, total, world-covering. The heavens open. The deep rises. The boat floats above a vanished earth. That is mythic language, not a measured account. But mythic language has its own truth. It tells us how large the change felt. For a family leaving its home, a flooded valley can feel like the whole world. For a child watching the last roof of a village disappear beyond reeds and mist, the loss may be as complete as any cosmic deluge. For elders whose parents were buried on land now unreachable, the water does not merely cover soil. It covers belonging. Imagine the day the village decides to leave. There is no shouting in this version of the story. Only quiet movement. A woman wraps seeds in cloth and ties them carefully with a strip of leather. A man lifts a polished stone tool from the corner of the house and places it in a basket beside a small knife, a spool of cord, and a fishing weight. Someone carries clay tablets or marked pieces of clay, records of grain, names, debts, offerings, or prayers, wrapped against the damp as if the marks themselves were living things. A child is handed a small carved figure, worn smooth from being touched by many hands. An older woman takes ashes from the hearth and seals them in a little clay bowl. Not because ashes can rebuild a house, but because some part of home must travel. Outside, the boats are waiting. They are not grand ships from legend. They are low river boats, wooden frames and reed bundles, dark with water, smelling of mud and smoke. Into them go baskets of grain, bundles of reeds, clay jars, sleeping mats, goats if there is room, chickens if they can be caught, tools, seeds, a woven blanket, a cup used in offerings, a stone from the threshold. The things people carry when they do not know whether they are leaving for a few nights or forever. And then the boats push away. The village does not vanish behind them. Not yet. It remains there in the gray light, half surrounded by water, smoke rising from a few last fires, doorways dark, walls damp near the base. From a distance, it may look almost peaceful. That is what makes the image so haunting. The world after loss can look gentle. Water reflects the sky. Reeds move softly. Birds settle where people once worked. A boat passes over a place where children used to run. The people travel toward higher ground. Behind them, their settlement grows smaller. Before them, the hill rises, stony and unfamiliar. They carry food, tools, animals, seeds, and sacred objects. But they carry something heavier too. They carry the knowledge that the earth can change its mind. In archaeological interpretation, movements like this may have happened many times in many places. Communities have always adapted to changing rivers, shifting coasts, floods, droughts, storms, and changing climates. Some moved temporarily. Some moved permanently. Some rebuilt in the same place. Some joined other settlements. Some disappeared from the record, leaving only fragments in mud, shell, stone, and buried layers. We must be careful. We cannot take every flood myth and say, this exact scene happened here. But we can imagine the emotional truth that such stories preserve. The experience of watching familiar land turn into water. The ache of leaving. The strange silence after the decision is made. The way memory begins to divide time into before and after. On higher ground, the first nights would have been restless. The air would feel different. The river would sound farther away, or too close, depending on the wind. The stars would be the same, but they would shine over a different horizon. People might light a fire and sit around it with the belongings they had saved arranged nearby, as if each object needed to be counted again and again. Seeds, tools, clay tablets, sacred cup, carved figure, fishing weights, the little bowl of hearth ash. A child might fall asleep against a bundle of reeds, dreaming of the old house. Someone might wake in the night and listen for the sound of water moving below. Someone might wonder whether the fields would return. Someone else might already know that they would not. In the morning, they would look down. From the hill, the changed world could be seen more clearly. The river no longer followed only its old channel. The lowlands shone in patches. The fields were broken by silver lanes of water. Trees stood with their trunks submerged. The path from village to field disappeared halfway across the plain. Farther away, where land once faded into grass and scrub, there was now a wider gleam, a new brightness under the sun. The water had made a new map. And the people standing above it had to learn that map while still grieving the old one. This is where the flood changes memory. Not only land. Memory. A person who has never seen the world change may tell stories differently from a person who has watched a home become unreachable. Before the water, stories may have explained why the river rose, why the stars moved, why the gods sent rain, why seeds slept and woke again. After the water, stories had another task. They had to explain loss. They had to explain why the old place was gone. They had to hold the names of fields that children would never see. They had to remember the route of a road now hidden below reeds. They had to teach where not to build, when to watch the sky, which dreams to take seriously, which animals sensed rain, which hills stayed dry, which objects had been carried by the ancestors when the waters came. A myth can become a map for the wounded. It can say, remember the high place. Remember the boat. Remember the seeds. Remember the warning. Remember that the world can change. In the ancient flood stories, survivors often become more than survivors. They become carriers. Utnapishtim in the Mesopotamian tradition carries life beyond destruction. Atrahasis preserves humanity through divine warning and a vessel. Deucalion and Pyrrha in Greek tradition become part of a story of human renewal after waters cover the land. Again, these are myths. They do not all point neatly to one historical event. But they share a shape that feels deeply human. Someone is warned. Something is built or prepared. The waters come. The old world disappears. A remnant survives. The earth is renewed, but not restored. That last distinction matters. Renewed is not the same as restored. To restore means to return things as they were. To renew means life begins again, but differently. After the water, people may still plant grain. They may still fish. They may still build houses from clay, reed, wood, or stone. They may still sing to children at night and offer food to the gods. But now the stories are different. Now the river is watched more carefully. Now the sea is respected with a little more fear. Now the old woman who dreams of rain is heard. Now the unusual behavior of birds is remembered. Now the height of last year's flood is marked on stone or wall or memory. Now every child is told where the family went when the water came. And slowly, human culture becomes a vessel too. Not made of wood or reeds. Made of warnings. Rituals. Songs. Names. Rules. Sacred days. Generations. This is how catastrophe can change people without changing their bodies. It changes what they listen for. It changes what they fear. It changes what they teach. It changes what they believe must never be forgotten. Picture grandparents many years later, standing with children on a hill above a quiet sheet of water. The day is calm. The sky is pale. Reeds shimmer in the breeze. Birds step lightly through the shallows. To the children, this place has always been water. They know its smell. They know its insects. They know where fish gather. They cannot imagine it otherwise. But the grandparents point toward the shining distance. There, they say. There was a field. And beyond it, the road. And there, where the reeds are thick, your great-grandmother's house stood. The children look. They see only water. But they listen. And in listening, they receive a vanished world. This may be one of the oldest kinds of inheritance. Not land. But the memory of land. A place can be lost in the world and still survive in words. For a time, that may be enough. But memory changes as it is carried. The field under water becomes the drowned field. The drowned field becomes the place the river took. The place the river took becomes the village before the flood. The village before the flood becomes the old world. And the old world, in the soft distance of generations, becomes sacred. Not because it was perfect. No human world ever was. But because it was gone. Loss gives shape to memory. Distance gives it light. And the farther people move from the event, the more the story grows large enough to carry meanings that facts alone cannot hold. The flood is no longer only a flood. It becomes the moment the gods judged humanity. Or the moment the earth was cleansed. Or the moment the first ancestors were chosen. Or the moment wisdom was hidden and then recovered. Or the moment people learned that survival requires obedience, preparation, humility, and memory. In this way, flood myths may preserve emotional truth even when their details belong to sacred storytelling rather than history. They say, the world we knew was taken away. They say, we survived because someone remembered, listened, built, carried, or was warned. They say, after the water, we were not the same. And perhaps this was the deepest change. People became watchers. They watched the sky. They watched the river. They watched the behavior of animals before storms. They watched the color of clouds at sunset. They watched the sound of wind in reeds. They watched the way water gathered near the door after rain. They watched where children played. They watched where houses were built. They listened more carefully to elders who remembered older waters. They told stories not only to comfort, but to protect. A child drifting toward sleep beside a fire might hear the story of the flood not as entertainment, but as inheritance. When the river rises beyond the third stone, go to the hill. When the birds leave the marsh early, watch the sky. When the sea draws back strangely, do not follow it. When the old people say they have seen this before, listen. Myth and memory meet in such sentences. They are not quite science. Not quite poetry. Not quite religion. They are human survival braided into story. And all the while, the water continues to move. In some places, it retreats. In others, it stays. In others, it leaves behind silt, reeds, fish bones, driftwood, broken walls, and fields so changed that even when dry, they no longer feel like themselves. A family may return weeks later and find mud in the house. A year later and find reeds in the doorway. A generation later and find no doorway at all. The old temple or shrine, if it still stands, may be stained by water lines. Offerings may have washed away. A statue may lean. A clay platform may crack in the sun. The sacred place that once stood at the center of the settlement now stands at the edge of something new. Or beneath it. Imagine a person returning by boat to where the village once was. The water is calm. Too calm. The paddle enters silently. A roof beam appears beneath the surface, dark and blurred. A storage jar lies half buried in silt. Fish move through a doorway. The person does not speak. There is nothing to say that the water does not already know. They reach down and take one small thing from the mud. A stone from the threshold. A piece of painted clay. A broken cup. Something ordinary. Something that was never meant to become sacred until it was almost lost. Then they turn the boat back toward the hill. Because sometimes the past can be visited, but not lived in. That is another lesson after the flood. There are places memory may return to, but the body cannot. There are homes that survive only as directions. Walk toward the old sycamore. Turn where the road used to bend. Look under the water when the light is low. There. That is where we were. And as these stories passed from mouth to mouth, night after night, generation after generation, they may have slowly entered the language of gods. A rising river became divine anger. A saved boat became divine mercy. A surviving family became chosen. A mountain above the flood became holy. A warning dream became prophecy. A carried seed became the beginning of agriculture after destruction. A clay tablet saved from damp became memory itself, hardening in human hands. In the quiet after catastrophe, people often rebuild with the materials they have. Wood. Reed. Mud. Stone. But they also rebuild with meaning. Why did this happen? Why did we live? What did we lose? What must we remember? What must our children know? These questions may have shaped some of the earliest ways people thought about law, kingship, ritual, and sacred order. Not because flood alone created civilization. That would be too simple. Human history is never one cause. It is river and climate, grain and labor, trade and conflict, imagination and necessity, accident and invention, all moving together like currents joining in a wide delta. But the memory of great water may have been one current among many. A deep current. A quiet one. A current that taught people not to trust the world too easily. As years passed, the survivors would make a new life on higher ground. At first, their houses might be temporary. Branches, reeds, clay gathered quickly. Fires protected from wind. Jars placed in dry places. Seeds opened carefully and planted in unfamiliar soil. Animals watched closely. Children told not to go down alone. Then, slowly, the temporary becomes permanent. A storage room. A stronger wall. A raised platform. A path worn into the hill. A small shrine with the rescued sacred cup placed inside. The old hearth ash scattered into a new hearth. Life begins again. But not as before. Because now, even on quiet evenings, when the sky is clear and the river looks harmless, the people know something they did not know in the same way before. The world can be lost. A home can become a memory. The line between land and water can move. The places that seem eternal can disappear under reeds, silt, and reflection. And yet, people can carry seeds. They can carry fire. They can carry names. They can carry stories. They can wake on higher ground and begin again. This is the gentle mystery at the heart of the flood. It is not only that water came. It is that after the water, humanity may have looked at the world differently. The river was no longer simply a giver. It was a keeper of secrets. The sea was no longer only an edge. It was a memory of lost land. The rain was no longer only weather. It was a voice that could awaken old fear. And the hill was no longer only a hill. It was the place that remained. Picture the survivors standing there in the soft light after many days. The rain has ended. The clouds have thinned. Below them, the water glows under the early sun, wide and still, broken by reeds, rooftops, trees, and the faint lines of land not yet dry. People stand quietly with baskets at their feet. Seeds wrapped in cloth. Tools dark with use. Clay tablets drying in the open air. Sacred objects placed carefully on a stone. Children hold close to their mothers and fathers. Elders look down toward the place where the road used to begin. No one knows yet what the new world will ask of them. Then, slowly, the waters begin to retreat. A little mud appears. Then a stone. Then the top of an old boundary wall. Then a path, or what remains of one, shining wet beneath the morning. For a moment, hope rises. Perhaps they can go back. Perhaps the old world has only been sleeping beneath the water. Perhaps the fields will return, and the houses, and the names of places, and the familiar life that waited before the rain. So they descend carefully. They walk toward what was left. And as they come closer, they understand. The water is leaving. But it is not giving the same world back. When the waters left, they did not take silence with them. They left it behind. A wide, listening silence over mud, reeds, broken paths, and fields that no longer knew their old shapes. The survivors walked carefully through it. Their feet sank into soft earth. Their hands touched walls stained by water lines. Their eyes searched for familiar things, and found them changed. A doorway still standing, but opening onto empty sky. A jar half buried in silt. A tree leaning over a pool where a courtyard had once been. A road returning for a little distance, then disappearing beneath reeds. The flood had passed. But the old world had not simply come back. And so, slowly, gently, almost like waking from a long and troubled dream, people began to build again. Not in the same places. Not quite. The memory of water had entered the hand. It changed where a person placed a wall. It changed how high a floor was raised. It changed where grain was stored. It changed the way elders looked at the river before choosing a site for a house. On a hill above the old drowned land, the first new fires appeared. At dusk, the smoke rose into clear air. Families gathered stones and packed clay. They cut reeds from the marsh below, though now the marsh was watched with a new caution. They shaped beams from wood and carried baskets of earth up the slope. The first shelters were simple. A roof against night air. A wall against wind. A place for children to sleep without hearing water at the door. But even the simplest shelter can feel sacred after loss. A mat laid on dry ground. A jar placed upright. A cooking fire protected from the rain. A hand smoothing clay over a crack in the wall. These were not only acts of survival. They were small declarations. We are still here. The new settlement formed slowly, house by house, path by path. At first, everything seemed temporary. People spoke of rebuilding with the cautious language of those who have been hurt by certainty. For now, they said. Until the fields dry. Until we understand the river. Until we know where the water will go. But days became seasons. Seasons became years. The hill became home. The path up the slope deepened beneath many feet. Children who had been carried there in boats began to run between the houses, knowing the higher ground as the center of the world. To them, the drowned fields below were not lost homes. They were stories. And this is how the world after the flood began to separate from the world before it. The old people had memory. The young people had inheritance. They had not seen the road disappear. But they knew the story of it. They had not slept in the old reed houses near the river. But they knew where those houses had stood, because someone pointed toward the water again and again, until the gesture became part of family life. There. The old path. There. The first field. There. The shrine of your grandmother. There. Where the reeds are thick. The children looked and saw only the bright surface of water, birds moving through grass, and the soft line of the marsh under morning light. But in their minds, another world began to rise. A remembered world. A world made from the words of elders. And perhaps this is where rebuilding meaning began. After a flood, a house can be rebuilt with clay. But a lost world must be rebuilt with story. The survivors gathered what they had carried. Seeds wrapped in cloth. Tools darkened by use. A sacred cup. A carved figure. Clay tablets or marked tokens drying carefully in the sun. A stone from the old threshold. Ashes from the old hearth. None of these objects could restore the vanished settlement. But together, they formed a small bridge between before and after. Imagine a new shrine being made on the hill. Not grand. Not yet. A raised place of packed earth, smooth beneath careful hands. A few stones set in a circle. A wooden post. A clay basin. The rescued sacred objects placed inside at sunset. The cup that had once held offerings near the river. The little figure worn by generations of touch. The threshold stone from a house that no longer stood. The bowl that held ash from the old fire. The people gathered around it quietly. No one needed to explain why these things mattered. They had crossed the water. They had survived. And because they survived, they became more than objects. They became witnesses. The shrine did not only honor a god or spirit. It honored continuity. It said, the water took the place, but not the memory. From such gestures, rituals may grow. A cup of water poured each year for those who lived below. A bowl of grain placed for the ancestors who crossed. A song sung when the river rose in spring. Children led to the hilltop and shown the safe path. A story told before the rainy season, slowly, carefully, with the same words each time, so no one would forget. In myth, divine warnings often come before the flood. A god speaks. A dream arrives. A wise person listens. A boat is built. Life is preserved. In historical interpretation, we might see behind such images the memory of warning signs, accumulated knowledge, careful observation, and the deep respect ancient communities had for those who could read weather, river, animal movement, and the mood of the land. But in the old stories, these forms of knowledge become sacred. A warning is not merely practical. It is divine. A survivor is not merely fortunate. They are chosen. A high hill is not merely safer. It is holy. This is how memory becomes religion. This is how survival becomes meaning. And as the new settlement grew, people may have begun to create rules. Do not build below the old stone. Store grain above the flood mark. Keep boats ready when the rains begin. Listen when the elders speak of strange water. Do not mock the old stories. Do not forget the names of those who crossed. Some rules would have been practical. Some ritual. Some both. Because in the ancient world, the line between practical wisdom and sacred duty was often thin as mist. A rule about where to store grain could become a command from the ancestors. A warning about the river could become a story about the gods. A remembered hill could become a sacred mountain in miniature, the place where life remained above the waters. And from these layers, early society may have taken new shape. Not everywhere in the same way. Not because one flood created all civilization. History is wider and more complicated than one cause. Civilizations grew from many roots: farming, trade, climate, conflict, cooperation, invention, ritual, labor, geography, and imagination. But perhaps, in some places, the memory of water became one quiet root. A root below the visible walls. Below the temples. Below the laws. Below the lists of kings. A memory saying, preserve what matters, because the world can change. Picture clay tablets drying in the sun. They lie in neat rows near a wall, still soft enough to mark, firm enough to hold meaning. A hand presses signs into clay. Perhaps they record grain. Perhaps names. Perhaps offerings. Perhaps debts, boundaries, families, or old stories slowly becoming fixed in a new form. The tablet is small. The sunlight is warm. A child watches. The person writing does not know they are participating in something immense. They are simply trying to remember. How much grain is stored? Who owns which field? Which family came from the lower village? Which offering belongs to which shrine? Which season the water rose highest? Writing, where it emerged, was not born from one emotion alone. It served accounts, administration, trade, temples, kings, and daily order. But in a sleep story like this, we can imagine its quieter symbolic meaning too. To mark clay is to ask memory to remain after the voice is gone. To dry a tablet in the sun is to give thought a body. After the flood, such acts would have felt especially powerful. A spoken memory can fade. A path can drown. A house can fall. But a mark in clay might endure. And so the world after the water became a world that recorded. Counting jars. Naming ancestors. Listing offerings. Measuring fields. Remembering kings. Preserving warnings. There is something deeply human in this. After loss, people begin to count what remains. Not only because they fear losing more, but because to count is to say that something still has order. Here are the seeds. Here are the families. Here are the animals. Here are the days since the water. Here are the names. Here is what survived. From the hill, the river was watched carefully. Every morning, someone looked down toward the lowland. Not with panic. Not always with fear. Sometimes simply with respect. The river had fed them. The river had frightened them. The river had taken and given, covered and revealed, divided the old world from the new. At dawn, mist rose from it in pale veils. Birds moved over the reeds. Fish disturbed the surface. The water looked innocent. And perhaps that was why it was watched. Because people knew that gentleness and power can live in the same thing. A river can glitter beneath the moon and still remember the flood. A sea can carry boats and still cover old roads. Rain can sing softly on a roof and still awaken ancestral fear. In the new villages above old drowned lands, daily life returned. It always does, eventually. Bread was baked. Children grew. Animals were led to pasture. Seeds were planted in soil that felt less familiar, then gradually became familiar through use. Marriages were arranged. Tools were repaired. The dead were buried in new ground. People laughed again, softly at first, then freely. But beneath the return of life, the memory remained. It shaped the buildings. It shaped the stories. It shaped the way people explained power. Perhaps this is why flood survivors in myth often stand near the beginning of new human orders. After the waters, there may be new laws. New covenants. New lineages. New kings. New sacred places. New explanations for why humans must live carefully beneath heaven. In Mesopotamian traditions, lists of ancient kings sometimes stretch across the divide between before and after a great flood, as if time itself had been cut by water. In mythic imagination, the flood is not simply one event among others. It becomes a boundary in the memory of the world. Before. After. The old age. The new one. And boundaries need guardians. So perhaps kings became more than strong men. Perhaps they became keepers of order against chaos. Perhaps laws became more than rules. They became walls made of words. Perhaps temples became more than houses for gods. They became promises that the human world would not dissolve again into confusion. This is interpretation. Not certainty. But it helps us feel why ancient stories often place civilization close to catastrophe. A world that has suffered disorder longs for order. A people who have seen the river break its boundary may become deeply concerned with boundaries of every kind. Where land ends. Where fields begin. Who owns grain? Who speaks for the god? Who leads in danger? Who remembers the old warning? Who decides when the boats must be prepared? In such a world, the first city is not only a concentration of houses. It is a memory system. Walls hold people together. Storehouses hold grain against uncertain seasons. Temples hold offerings and stories. Records hold names. Rituals hold fear in a shape people can endure. A city says, "We have gathered what survived, and we will make it last." Imagine one of these early centers rising above the floodplain. At first, it is only a larger village. Then a raised platform appears. Then a shrine becomes a temple. Then storage rooms are built with thicker walls. Then a courtyard opens where people gather at certain times of the year. Then paths from smaller settlements begin to lead toward it. Boats arrive with baskets. Travelers bring news. Elders speak with those who count grain and watch the river. Children look up at the high platform and are told that this is where offerings are made so the world remains in balance. The temple rises slowly. Brick by brick. Season by season. Its walls hold sunlight during the day and warmth after dusk. From its upper level, a person can see the river glinting in the distance, the lowlands, the marshes, and perhaps beyond them, the place where older homes once stood. A temple in such a story is not merely built upward. It is built against forgetting. Each brick says, remember. Each offering says, remember. Each ritual says, remember what water can do, and remember what survived it. The ancient myths speak of chosen survivors. A man warned in a dream. A family saved in a vessel. A pair left to renew humanity. A mountain where the boat comes to rest. Sacred stories do not behave like archaeology. They do not preserve the past in straight lines. They preserve meaning in images. A boat may be a boat. It may also be a womb, a world, a temple, a chest of memory floating above loss. A mountain may be a mountain. It may also be safety, closeness to heaven, the first dry place, the first altar after fear. A survivor may be a person. They may also be every ancestor who carried something forward when everything familiar changed. When we listen gently, we do not need to flatten these stories into either fact or fantasy. We can let them be what they are. Myths that speak in symbols. Possible memories of floods, rising waters, and lost landscapes. Interpretations shaped by later cultures. And imaginative echoes of real human emotions. Fear. Gratitude. Guilt. Relief. Wonder. The need to begin again. After the water, people would have asked why. Why were we spared? Why was the old settlement taken? Why did the warnings come too late? Why did one hill remain dry? Why did the river rise higher than the elders remembered? Why did the gods allow the fields to vanish? These questions do not sleep easily. So people gave them homes. Some questions were placed in rituals. Some in laws. Some in songs. Some in stories of divine anger or divine mercy. Some in lists of ancestors. Some in the naming of children after those who had crossed the water. And each generation inherited both the question and the answer, though the answer changed as it passed from voice to voice. A grandmother tells a child, "Our people survived because your ancestor listened." A priest says, "The God warned us so we would build." A king says, "Order must be kept, because chaos once covered the land." A farmer says, "Watch the river." A mother says, "Keep the seeds dry." A scribe presses signs into clay. A builder raises the floor higher. A child dreams of a road beneath water. All of them are living in the world after the flood. Not simply the world after rain. The world after certainty. And perhaps this is the quiet transformation at the center of the story. The flood did not only move people from low ground to high ground. It moved human imagination. Before the water, the world may have been imagined as a circle that returned. After the water, the world became something with a wound in it. A past that could disappear. A present that had to be guarded. A future that required warning. This may be one reason ancient civilizations became so devoted to memory. Genealogies. King lists. Temple records. Ritual calendars. Sacred stories. Flood accounts. Founding myths. Names pressed into clay. Names carved into stone. Names repeated at the fire when children grew sleepy. To remember was not only to honor the past. It was to protect the future. Of course, we should remain gentle with certainty. We cannot say that civilization began because of one flood, or that every city was built from one wound of water. The real beginning of cities was complex, shaped by rivers, crops, labor, trade, climate, belief, and countless decisions made by people whose names we will never know. But as a sleep mystery, as a soft journey through ancient memory, we can wonder. Maybe some of humanity's first great centers were not only built for power. Maybe they were also built for preservation. To keep grain from hunger. To keep records from forgetting. To keep gods close. To keep families gathered. To keep meaning alive after the world had shown how easily a home could vanish. A wall, then, was not only defense. It was a line drawn against uncertainty. A storehouse was not only storage. It was trust in tomorrow. A shrine was not only devotion. It was gratitude that something had survived. A law was not only command. It was memory shaped into instruction. A city was not only a city. It was a promise. We will not scatter. We will remember. We will build above the water. We will teach our children the names of what was lost. Imagine evening in the new settlement many years later. The houses on the hill are stronger now. Their walls are smoother. The paths are clear. A raised platform stands near the center, and upon it the shrine has grown into something more formal, with a basin, offerings, and perhaps a small chamber where sacred objects are kept. The rescued cup is there. The old carved figure is there. The threshold stone sits at the base, touched by those who know what it means. Nearby, clay tablets dry in the last gold of the sun. A scribe lifts one and turns it carefully so the edges harden. Beyond the settlement, the river shines in the distance. Not far enough to be forgotten. Not close enough to rule every breath. Children sit near an elder as the light fades. The elder points toward the lowlands. Now green in places. Marshy in others. Beautiful, in the way healed places can be beautiful without ever being unchanged. There, the elder says, was the road. There, the fields. There, the first houses. There, where the birds gather, we tied the boats. The children listen. Some are restless. Some are nearly asleep. One holds a small clay toy. Another watches smoke rise from a cooking fire. They are too young to understand everything, but they understand the softness in the elder's voice. They understand that the water below is not ordinary water. It is a keeper of names. And as the story continues, the lost world becomes present again. Not as it was. Never exactly. But enough to live inside memory. Perhaps this is all any civilization can do. Build something strong enough to shelter the living, and meaningful enough to carry the dead. The flood stories remain because they speak to something that never fully leaves human beings. The knowledge that everything familiar can change. The house. The road. The shoreline. The language. The gods. The order of the world. Even the places that seem permanent may one day become stories told from a hill. And yet, the stories do not end with water covering everything. They end with someone surviving to speak. Someone carrying seeds. Someone lighting a new fire. Someone marking clay. Someone building a shrine. Someone teaching children where the old world sleeps. This is why flood myths are not only about fear. They are about memory refusing to drown. They are about the fragile courage of people who begin again without pretending nothing was lost. They are about the strange human ability to turn grief into ritual, danger into wisdom, and broken ground into a foundation. At night, after the settlement sleeps, the river continues its slow movement below. Moonlight rests on its surface. Reeds bend and rise. Frogs call from the marsh. The temple stands quietly on the hill, holding warmth from the day. Inside, the rescued objects sit in shadow. A cup. A figure. A stone. A bowl that once held ashes from an older hearth. No one is awake to look at them. But they remain. And in their stillness, they seem to say what the people themselves have been saying all along. Something was lost. Something was carried. Something began again. The world after the flood was not empty. It was full of remnants. Seeds from the old fields. Tools from the old houses. Names from the old families. Stories from the old nights. Fears from the old water. Hopes from the new hill. And from these remnants, people made more than shelter. They made meaning. Maybe that is what history often is. Not the clean beginning we imagine, but the careful arrangement of what survived. A clay tablet drying in the sun. A wall built higher than before. A child learning the name of a drowned road. A temple rising above a river plain. A law spoken so that the next generation knows what to do when the water climbs. A myth carried forward because it tells the truth in a language deeper than record. Water came. The old world changed. We lived. Remember. And so, the calm ancient mystery remains with us. Not as a single proven flood covering every land. Not as a simple answer hidden inside one myth. But as a question flowing beneath many old stories. What did humanity become after learning that the world could disappear? Perhaps the first civilizations were not only the beginning of history. Perhaps they were also shelters for memory. Built by people who had seen rivers leave their banks, shores change shape, and familiar places become unreachable. Built by people who understood that a house can fall, a field can drown, and a road can vanish, but a story, if carried carefully, can cross the water. And in the quiet before sleep, we can imagine them still. The survivors on the hill. The new village above the old drowned land. The temple rising slowly in the amber light. The river watched from a distance. The children listening. The elders remembering. The clay tablets drying beneath the sun. The sacred objects resting in the shrine. The world, wounded but awake. And somewhere below, beneath reeds, silt, and moonlit water, the older world remains. Not gone completely. Only changed into memory. Perhaps the world after the flood was not the first world. Perhaps it was the first world that remembered losing one.